Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and we have a great show today. We're going to have the opportunity to sort of look inside one of the well-known proxy advisory firms at Glass Lewis and Company. And we're going to be able to do that through my guest. And let me introduce Robert McCormick, who is the Chief Policy Officer with Glass Lewis and Company. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, TK. Pleasure to be here.
And while I suspect that most of our audience knows who Glass Lewis is, let's not assume that that's the case. So why don't you take a moment and just explain a little bit about Glass Lewis, its proxy advisory responsibilities, and its mission.
Sure. So Glass Lewis is a proxy advisory service. So we provide analysis, research, and ultimately voting recommendations to institutional investors, mainly public pensions and mutual funds, about issues that come up at annual meetings and special meetings of shareholders. So anything that shareholders get to vote at the annual meeting, special meeting, we'll analyze, provide a lot of detail, research, some background information, and then ultimately make a recommendation. So we see our goal is really to empower our clients with information so they can make informed voting decisions. So I always say we kind of occupy a unique little niche within financial services. So we're not saying buy or sell this company, but you've already bought the company. Now how do you mitigate the risk through the power of the ballot? And we help our clients do that through providing them with information so they can make good voting decisions.
So some people will look at your data and evaluate that within their own contexts. Some may just take your recommendations outright, and that's how they're going to vote their positions in there. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the clients use our research in a whole range of ways. The larger clients, the largest public pensions, mutual funds, they may actually use several research providers. So for them, it's just another complement to their overall research process. As you sort of move down towards the smaller investment firms, they may look a little bit more closely just at one research provider, and then they may look a bit more closely at the recommendations as a pretty strong indication of how they may vote. But ultimately, most of our clients have their own policies, and they're using our research really to make an informed voting decision. Now, some may tend to follow our recommendations, but they tend to be the really small shops that will outsource lots of stuff, including the investment decision-making on behalf of their investments.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the sort of the key questions relative to the relationship between boards and proxy advisory firms, I want to ask you just your observation, since you actually sit with so many boards and board members. You've had a chance over time to sort of evaluate the lay of the land, if you will. So my two-part question to you is, in the last couple of years, where have you seen great progress in the boardroom and with board members? And then where would you identify that sort of boards haven't come as far as they should have come, maybe in that same period?
Sure. And thinking of progress, I think the biggest thing is more board independence and board members who are independently, I would say, located, nominated, and then ultimately elected. If you flash to 15, 16 years ago, this is my 16th proxy season, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, many of the boards were sort of friends of the CEO. And that wasn't necessarily automatically a bad thing, but it meant there was less independent oversight if there was a problem at that company. As the years sort of progressed and there was more attention focused on boards, there was really the role of, what is the board doing? Who are these board members? Do they have enough experience? Particularly as the company evolves itself. So I think boards have done a really good job of eliminating some of those directors who are only there because they were golfing buddies, so to speak, of the CEO, and really finding people with relevant experience. So the number of board with conflicted board members that have even a personal relationship, never mind meeting a, say, New York Stock Exchange definition of independence only, those have really been eliminated. So I kind of joke with some of my friends that the sort of independence problem has really been resolved to the large extent. Now, in terms of what boards could potentially continue to do better, I think the opportunity for engagement with shareholders is one area. Now, there's been a lot of talk about engagement in the last several years. Part of the rationale for Say on Pay was to encourage engagement, and that's what we have seen, certainly since that was adopted. And I don't mean it just for to have a meeting and sort of put a face behind, you know, an entity, but really to understand better some of the decision making that went behind, particularly compensation, but other aspects of the company. So you take an issue like independent chairman, whether those roles should be separated. I think those explanations are much more effective and constructive on a face-to-face basis with, say, the lead independent director who describes his or her role and how much time they spend, their responsibilities and duties, etc. That, I think, is a further opportunity for boards to continue to do that. A relatively small number of directors will engage directly with shareholders. Now, that's growing, but I think that's an opportunity for boards to really consider, particularly if it's an issue that warrants a bit more discussion or conversation. I think they could really do themselves a service by engaging on those issues.
Well, you've given me the great segue into the issue that I really want to talk about, and that is the engagement between the boards and proxy advisory firms. And I say firms, really there's two that sort of are well known in this space, ISS and yourself. So, part of the frustration, I think, is that whenever there's a mode that's check the box, where there isn't that interaction, where a company board feels like they're doing the right thing for shareholder value and for the shareholders, but it doesn't look good in the checks the box sort of scenario. There's an effort to reach out. Again, I don't know how effective I'm speaking in generalities, how effective companies are in reaching out, but certainly we've seen, you've spoken on panels, I've had you speak on panels. We've certainly seen a lot of frustration on the idea that when somebody's trying to communicate why they're not having the opportunity to do that. Votes go against, say, on pay or on individual directors. Now we have a very, very adversarial relationship, and frankly, it's not unusual for directors to be very upset with the organization. So my question to you, knowing all that, and nothing I've said is obviously news to you, but so what is Glass Lewis doing? What have you done, and what are you doing going forward to make sure that there is better communication, and even in the hopes that it doesn't have to be adversarial before the conversation even starts? Yeah,
I think it's unfortunate in some ways that the conversations they begin in a somewhat contentious atmosphere, because in my experience they can actually be very constructive. And I think sometimes going into it, people assume there's going to be more contention than there really is. I think there's a lot of agreement on a lot of issues. I do want to suggest, though, our approach is decidedly not check the box, and that's one of our distinguishing features, we feel. But part of that, I think, is perhaps a misconception that we can do a better job of explaining that we do look at things on a case-by-case basis, whether it's share proposals, compensation, those sorts of things. We tend not to be very black and white on issues, and that's where the engagement comes into play. So if we do get a request from a company to speak with them, to meet with them, then we always accept that. In fact, I was speaking to 2 different companies this morning. So it's something we do quite frequently. I think, again, that's probably something we can do better to make it more widely known that we do this and are open to it. We relaunched our website last year and designed a particular web page just for issuers. It's called the Issuer Portal, and includes a lot of background information on Glass Lewis. Who we are, what our role is, what our processes are, some examples of our guidelines, and sets up an opportunity for companies to contact us. One, if they think there's an error in our report, so then we can track those, make sure that we respond to those and correct them if necessary. And also if they want to request a meeting. So we feel that has been a very effective way to be a bit more transparent about, one, how Glass Lewis works, but also in terms of how we could potentially engage with companies. And again, we're very open to it. I think in the last couple of years, I would say we've roughly spoken with, between 800 and 1,000 companies in our various locations all over the world.
Well, certainly Say on Pay has heightened the need for communication, and if that was one of the goals of Say on Pay as a non-binding advisory vote, and I don't think anybody really considers it non-binding in the context of what will maybe not happen immediately, but obviously companies need to respond if they haven't reached certain levels of shareholder support. But that has certainly picked up the game, that has made communications need to be more interactive.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right. It's funny, I almost think directors are more concerned with losing a say on pay vote than a vote against themselves. And I think they probably recognize that shareholders themselves are more likely to vote against a say on pay than to vote against a director. I mean, there's a very, very small number of directors who don't get elected. But similarly, there's only 63 companies that lost their say on pay in 2012 out of probably 2,800 roughly. So it's a really small number of companies that actually lose their say on pay. But back to the engagement, I think it has been effective of encouraging that dialogue, which I think sort of breaches some of the gaps in terms of either the understanding by the shareholder or the communication from the board. I think, I honestly feel boards really feel they're doing the right job and are, but sometimes it's the communication that doesn't fully explain that. And I'll give you an example. If you take, say, a proposal on to require or adopt an independent chairman type structure, some of the responses from companies tends to be quite boilerplate. Now, I completely respect that that is exactly what they did in terms of, the board looked at this structure and felt that in its judgment it was the best structure for the company. Now, that may be true, but when we see that and when other investors see that over and over again at many, many companies, it becomes an ineffective communication tool. So I think there's an opportunity there for boards to say, geez, hearing from an investor, maybe they want more information about why this particular structure makes sense for ourselves, how often we reevaluate this, what the role of the independent lead director is, how he or she interacts at the company, has responsibilities, those sorts of things. I think having the engagement encourages the companies to sort of learn what that information that they could provide better, and also helps the investor of, geez, maybe some of their things they take for granted in terms of what every company should have, maybe they might alter those after hearing from the company why this particular company needs something different.
Yeah, well, proxies are out of control. I mean, CDNAs and explanation, it'd be nice if you were limited to 3 paragraphs and just had to explain exactly what you were doing. I think in some cases that would be better than SEC requirements or whatever is in there. It's created a document that really makes it hard, to me, makes it hard to be useful for the rank and file. But
yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at his documents are written for several different audiences, of course the SEC and sort of by extension the average retail shareholder who is probably relatively unlikely to read that. So ultimately the people who are reading it closely are investors and proxy advisors like ourselves. So those, I think it's important for companies to keep in mind as their, in effect, target audience of explaining those sorts of compensation programs, not from a sort of a very high level, but being a bit more specific about the choice of performance metrics, why a certain one was selected, how it actually ties into the strategy of the company, maybe why the performance targets they've selected actually match up with what they told the street analysts, so there's actually a correlation between that. All that information I think is really helpful to the investor making a decision about, geez, this comp program may look a little bit different than the ones I've otherwise seen, but this company really seems to have figured it out because of the nature of their business, their time frame, et cetera.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel that shareholders and institutional investors want to make sure that the directors get it, that they at least get it. I wish there was a way to sort of convince them that this is a group that sort of gets it, because we've seen examples, they are in the paper all the time of people that don't get it.
Right.
But I'd say a majority of the people that I'm sure you see, and certainly I see, they get it. They know what's happening, and that's why we see the small incidences of say on pay or directors being voted out. So, and
it's interesting, the companies that are really proactive about engaging with their shareholders, the 2 companies I talked to today had received overwhelming shareholder support for all their proposals, and we had recommended in favor of every one of their proposals. But in maybe abundance of caution or just to be really engaged with their shareholders and proxy advisors, they wanted to reach out to us, which means some of the, maybe call them problem companies or companies that could maybe benefit from some of that dialogue are the ones not reaching out. And I'm sure there's a correlation there. If they did reach out, they'd probably learn a bit more, and then shareholders themselves would be more comfortable with that particular company.
Yeah, it's tough, shareholder engagement, because putting directors in front of shareholders, which has been their quest most recently, to so that somebody can evaluate whether the board does get it or not.
Right.
When people sort of bend those rules and put directors in uncomfortable positions and whatever, and then corporate attorneys advise them not to do it, it's only downside. We're going to have to solve that problem somehow on making sure that single interest investors aren't coming in with issues that are not necessarily general enough or good enough for sort of what's being asked in the way of does the board get it.
I agree. I think it's important to keep in mind, I'm not suggesting that every director has to meet with every shareholder. I mean, that would be an extreme position, right? Or even that every company needs a director who's doing this regularly. But I think it's those rare situations when the issue probably doesn't lend itself to a constructive engagement with a CEO or someone from management. So, for example, if the concern that shareholders have expressed is about CEO compensation, having the CEO in those dialogues is not a very effective way to explain either the concerns from the shareholders' perspective, because they're talking to the person about whose compensation they have concerns, and the CEO is not the one who designed the compensation; they're receiving it. So I think at least one narrow example, it's when it comes to CEO compensation, it probably makes more sense for someone from the comp committee to be on that in those meetings. But when it comes to maybe general governance, corporate secretary, head of IR, CFO, etc., those for the most part can really handle most of those issues.
Well, certainly if it's anything operating, I think it should be an operating
Absolutely.
officer. But, well, listen, my fear has been recognized. This time goes so quickly. There's so much more I really wanted to ask you, relative to this, but we're not going to have the time. I do want to tell you, Bob, that I really appreciate that you have identified where boards can go to make contact. I think that's very important. I appreciate that you've explained the website and how somebody can request a meeting or correct information. I think that's very important. And I want to thank you. I'll have to have you back in a future show just to make sure we get to ask the questions that we didn't get time to ask this time. But thanks for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime.
Well, that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll join us again next week where we'll take a look at another topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.